discussion of Evoking the Mulatto, a web series that's part of a transmedia project about 21st century Black mixed identity by multimedia artist Lindsay C. Harris. My name's Cassandra Jensen, and I'm a digital associate for the National Black Programming Consortium. We're hosting tonight's event live here in the YouTube space in New York City. Lindsay Harris, who is the creator of this project, was a digital media arts fellow with our organization, NBPC, when she began work on the series we are about to screen. Evoking the Mulatto consists of 4 short episodes, thoughtful, probing portraits of young artists and activists who identify as biracial and Black. Each segment addresses aspects of the mixed Black experience: childhood, family dynamics, dating, the politics of word choice, and more. So please sit back and enjoy Evoking the Mulatto.
Good evening and welcome to Evoking the Mulatto, a YouTube live stream sponsored by the National Black Programming Consortium. I'm Kay Shaw, Director of Programs and Acquisitions. For more than 35 years, NBPC has been committed to nurturing storytellers who bring stories about the Black experience to audiences that contribute to a dialogue on contemporary social, cultural, and political issues. If you're just joining us, you might have missed the earlier screening of the episodes 1 through 4 from the series. You can catch them on our website at blackpublicmedia.org and check out some of the other work that we fund exploring Black male identity, education issues in our urban and rural schools, historical and contemporary documentaries on cultural icons and events from the past. We are proud to have sponsored Digital Media Arts Fellow Lindsay Harris's transmedia series Evoking the Mulatto, which is both a historical and contemporary look at race in the 21st century. If you like what you've seen and the discussion that will follow, please consider making a tax-deductible year-end contribution to NBPC by selecting the Donate Now button on our website. Many thanks to YouTube for hosting us today, and would like to introduce our moderator, Maura Cuffey. Maura is a cultural arts programmer and arts administrator at EMC Arts, a project that works with organizations and individuals as they deal with complex challenges. She is also a Create Change Fellow with the Laundromat Project, a program that brings the arts directly to young people in community hubs like laundromats. And I have firsthand knowledge of this program because I watch them do their great work outside the laundromat in my building every weekend in the summer. So now, here's Laura to introduce the panelists who will elevate the conversation on tonight's thought-provoking subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kay, for the generous introduction. I'm really pumped to be here. Hey, everybody on the internet and in the room. I hadn't seen the 4th episode yet, and I'm feeling really struck by it, and I'm excited to also bring that into the conversation today. I have a little anxiety about this panel. I think facilitating a good conversation, I was talking to Lindsay about this the other day, is important work, and it's very different to have to do that about a topic that's intimate and dear to your heart. So I want to thank all the panelists here for being willing to have this conversation and share some lived experience. So I'm going to briefly introduce you all, and then we're just going to hop into it, onto all the hot button topics, yes. So first, to my left, the lovely Lindsay Catherine Harris is the creator of this project, Evoking the Mulatto, which one of the components is this web series, but there's also a few other things, portraits, and this really interesting historical mapping that you can find online. She's a Brooklyn-based media artist, activist, and educator, along with lots of other things, and is currently working with teen programs at the Brooklyn Museum. Hey, Lindsay. Hey. To to my right, we have Lisa Funderburg, who probably a lot of you have read. She wrote the amazing, groundbreaking book, Black, White, Other, Biracial Americans Talk About Race and Identity, which was originally published in 1994, which still feels like 4 years ago, like I still reference, right? Anyway, recently re-released in a 20th anniversary ebook edition, so be sure to check that out. And I think there's some new content in there as well, which is really awesome. And then to my far left, hey Lisa. We have Judy Pryor Ramirez, who's an educator and the director of the Civic Engagement and Social Justice Department at Eugene Lang, Hay New School, where she oversees a variety of programs for students, faculty, and community partners. She also recently co-authored a digital curriculum for materials that came out of Brooklyn Historical Society's project, Crossing Borders, Bridging Generations.
Yes.
Yes.
You got it.
Which is actually where we first met,
Yes.
and it's an awesome program. So, hi, Judy.
Hi, thank you.
And all the way over here, Giovanna Fisher, who you probably recognize from the videos that we just watched all together. She's an LA native and a longtime Brooklynite, an arts programmer and educator, and she currently serves as the Dean of Culture and Family Engagement at La Cima, is that correct? Elementary charter school, and which is in Ride or Die, Bed-Stuy. Yeah. I had to get a little joke in there. Okay. So to start us off, my first question is actually for you, Lindsay, and I'd love, Lisa, for you to hop onto it as well, considering your writing and your work. I think that this project as a whole is looking at the pungence, the violence, and the pun, sort of, at the word mulatto. So I'd love for you to begin telling us a little bit why you chose that word specifically, knowing the violence and the history of that word. Yeah, I'll let you go for it.
Yeah, thank you, Mara. So titling the project Evoking the Mulatto was not something I did lightly. And part of it was, how to talk about race and identity now when, in this last one, as we referenced, that we're in an age where there are a lot of glossing over, right? And we talk about being colorblind and progress and what does that mean? And for me, it was a way to talk about mixed race identity while clearly evoking that very violent and pungent, I like that word that you have, past, right? So we're evoking what mulatto means. And that, of course, has been traditionally, that's a word that's derived from the word mule, right? And it's a word that's been applied to mixed bodies and has, the exact definitions have changed a little bit throughout time, but basically a person who is, has one white parent and one black parent. And so just a way to kind of call attention to that history as a way of transcending out of it.
Yeah. I'm curious, Lisa, what you think, knowing now a little bit about your choice of words. When you learned about this project and said yes to this panel, what was striking to you about the language?
Well, actually, when I was asked to participate on the panel, I was a little hesitant because I sometimes I have concerns about how people talk about race and mixed race identity, and if they're not willing to allow it to be as complicated as it is, to leave enough room for people to have differences of opinions and belief systems around it, then I usually don't want to participate or don't find it fruitful to participate in that. And so I did a little research and looked at it and then saw, okay, phew, this is, this is people with strong and different opinions, and the word choices, certainly the term mulatto will engage you because it's a sensational term, and it has always been a sensational term. But what was interesting to me when I started looking at the broadcasts, at the videos, was how much the vocabulary, mulatto being one of those words, has expanded over the years since I did my book 20 years ago and collected those oral histories from adults, and even from when I was growing up. so I'm the old head on this panel, and when I was growing up, I don't think I knew the word mulatto until I was a young adult, and the words that would best describe me and my sisters most accurately were other and mixed. And so I was so grateful to have something, because not only were we mixed, but I was a stealth mulatto, because I was melanin challenged and had flat hair. And so the reality of my personal experience versus how the world used definitions was always, there was a dissonance there. So I think mulatto is a great way to enter into the conversation, and there are people who have strong feelings about it in these videos, and some who wholeheartedly reject it, and I'm not someone who would call myself that unless I'm joking and saying I'm a stealth mulatto. And in that way, just the way President Obama called himself a mutt, I was not offended by that. I thought there was room for humor. So I think it's a great way to get into it.
Yeah, so just to piggyback on that too, like this word and mulatto, and how, to call attention to it, but also like, oh, is that something I would use to like claim my own body? Like even just saying mulatto kind of gives me a little, so yeah, it's something too that like I kind of very much reject as, something that I would claim myself, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the not always so subtleties of language are really crucial to this project. I know I have a very clear memory of when I first came across that word, mulatto, and I'm curious, Judy and Giovanna, if you have some recollection of finding the word mulatto. For me, it was like a doubling, like, oh, here's this word that has this definition. I'm that thing. Is that what everyone sees me as? Yeah. Any thoughts?
For me, the word, I don't have a distinct memory of when I first encountered the word. And I think it's because I identify as Black and Mexican. My mother is Mexican-American from Corpus Christi, Texas. My father is Black from Richmond, Virginia. And so I think as the definition stands, it really constitutes and identifies a Black-white sort of mixing, right? So the word that, for me, that I've heard, and it's in Spanish, is mulata. And that's an older generational word to describe that idea of being a mixed-race person, but it was also not used. The word that I knew growing up, and the words that my mother used to describe us when I heard her speaking in Spanish to family members or other people in the community, was trigueña. And trigueña is a word that basically derives, as I understand it, from the word trigo, which is wheat, and it's really about the coloring of the skin, like wheat-colored skin, right? And so it's about a definition about the gradations of skin tones that we use in Spanish to describe people. And so that's how I came to understand sort of some language that I heard being used to describe my sisters and myself. It wasn't a term that I chose to identify and to use that term for myself, but that's how I became aware of language to describe who we were really early on, and that word. And I think also the word, the same way mulatto has a certain kind of sound to it and creates a sort of bodily sensation. For me, the word trigueño, trigueña also does that because of the ñ in the word, and it's just there's something that rolls off the mouth when I hear it, when I say it, that really just kind of gives me a kind of sensation in the same word that the word mulatto does.
Yeah.
My first encounter with the word mulatto was, so I grew up in Los Angeles and Venice, California, so it was pretty diverse, always like a lot of Mexican, a lot of Black folks, and a lot of Jewish folks, I remember primarily. And I remember I was playing with like a friend of a friend's daughter who was my age when I was like 8 or 9 years old. And she was from like the Inland Empire, so if you're from California, like it's different. It's not Los Angeles. And she was like from primarily like white, kind of like smaller town way of thinking. And so she saw my mom, and she's like, "You're a mulatto." And I never heard that, so naturally I went to my mom, said, "What's this word?" She explained it to me, and explained something about the like Southern context. She didn't like say antebellum South, and I remember being really interested, and it striking this interest for me in the South. And then I went on this whole inquiry, and I became really like oddly fascinated with Thomas Jefferson and slavery, and that led me to like Sally Hemings, and in that history, so I remember like 10, 11 years old, like really being immersed in that and just being curious and wanting to know and wanting to know. And there was the American Girl doll Addie, who was a slave, and I was just like, I want to know all about her. And that was like my portal to the South and to like understanding this word. But my mom, I remember that she didn't like the word. And I remember knowing immediately from my conversation with her that that's not a word we're going to use. And then eventually, when I was old enough to formulate my own opinion about the word, that was the word that I wasn't going to use. But similarly, like in humor, I believe we should talk about it. I think it's important to bring up in discussion, but I'm not going to use it to identify myself or anyone else for that matter.
Yeah, I love that you brought back into thinking about geography and place. I think the South particularly has this kind of mythic quality in my life as a young Black mixed woman. I think my family might also have this sentiment, thinking of the South as like this black mecca of blackness, like the South in Harlem, and what that means for how I identify, having lived in California and Philadelphia and other places. And I want to dog ear that for later, or parking lot. That's what they say, right? Thinking about my experience with the word mulatto came twice, one as a young person and one later in college, and I learned the term the tragic mulatto in a film class. And now being in more spaces where people are talking about mixed identity, I'm curious, how can we have a conversation? What are the tools that we need in order to have a conversation to not fall on that trope of, oh, woe is me. I'm so confused all the time. Sometimes I am confused. And I wonder if Judy and Lisa, if you might start us off talking about that.
You want to go?
Go ahead.
Well, I think that for me, the issue of the term tragic mulatto is more that it's placed upon us than we place it upon ourselves. And so how do you avoid creating a situation where that's the place that people go? You can't always avoid that. But I think the larger question of how do we have conversations about race that allow people to have the fluidity of identity that is, I think, inherently natural to us all, whatever those points of identity are that you flow between, and it could be political, it could be geographic, it could be any number of identifiers of the human condition, but specifically talking about race, that we have to be willing to allow for differences of opinion. And I think there's a real sense of regimentation about this thing, race, which actually most people now agree doesn't exist, and yet we're so invested. And for me, growing up the way I did, what became really clear was that my lived experience was distinct from the way people saw me, and that those two things were sometimes distinct from the political choices that I needed to make in my life. And so there's that complication. And so I think conversations that are going to get anywhere and operate on any kind of a sophisticated level have to allow for that multiplicity of factors in everybody's situation. And it's really hard because it's also human nature, I think, to look for your tribe, whatever that tribe may be, and also to decide whether people are, friend or foe, and how do we recognize that? And we stereotype people a lot. I was saying before we started that I have this staunch belief in the right of self-identification, even if I don't agree with you. And so for me, it makes no sense that people are calling out Obama for the way that he identifies. That's the way he identifies. But I would be lying if I didn't say that I sometimes hear how people talk about their identity and think, really? Are they really being honest with themselves? So I think that the components for sort of getting out of the mire and muck of the tragic mulatto issue is, one, to allow for people to commit to complexity. And, well, I guess that's the main one, I think.
Yeah. That's tough, though,
Yeah.
no?
I think I would just add on to that. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Open-mindedness. I think a willingness to fail and make mistakes and trying to understand very difficult conversations that that our schools don't allow for these kinds of critical conversations. So engaging in this kind of criticality, this kind of unpacking, and trying to make sense and creating, I think this term kind of gets overused, but safe enough spaces so that people can ask questions if they don't understand the history of the term. And I really do think, and this is what I teach to my students and the work that I do with undergraduates, is really understanding history, deconstructing terms, and co-creating new knowledge together, and really visioning for a future. And that's, to me, that's where the possibilities lie with this particular question.
Yeah, I think envisioning new space is hard, though. I think it's really hard because we can't see a thing until we act it, sort of. And what I really appreciate about this series is that there's a lot of play involved with the participants. That it's like a little awkward sometimes, but also funny and cute. And sometimes you can visibly see that there's some trauma that's happened there. I'm gonna go off the script a little bit. Bear with me, guys. Lisa, talking about claiming the right to claim identity is striking to me because I find we see a lot more mixed people claiming their raced part of themselves. Not that all mixed people are also associated with whiteness, but what might that mean today when we're still as racist as we are, right? That more and more I see people claiming blackness. I do myself. If you want to comment first, Lisa, and then anyone pop in.
Well, the quick thing I'd say about that is there's this interesting evolution in how we as a country quantify and qualify race. And so starting in the year 2000, the U.S. Census first asked people, allowed people to identify themselves as multiracial, mix more than one, and they actually tabulated that information, whereas in the past they would let you do that sometimes, but then reaggregate it back into monoracial categories. So as someone at the Census Bureau said, the answers you get depend on the questions you ask. So it's not necessarily that all of a sudden there was this baby boom, right? But that people were being given room to identify the way they are. And as we know, most people who have been brought up in families that were culturally, contextually identified as black families in this country, excuse me, have mixed race backgrounds. If you, it's so hard to talk about this because it's none of it's true. So, so I think we have more room. There's a larger population. There is more intermarriage between groups who used to stay separate. There's more intermarriage between non-white black mixes, and there are great. Speaking of humor, there are great language plays that younger people are doing where they call themselves Blaxican or Corgentinian or anything that you can think of, which is sort of a positive allowance for both of these to be together. I actually wouldn't use the term race to distinguish between white and black people, because if you're going to call black people a race, then you might as well call white people a race too. So that question actually doesn't work for me.
Yeah, you're right.
Well,
I tried it.
No, see, this is the thing. It doesn't discount you being able to do that.
Right.
It's just I'm saying that doesn't make sense in my math.
Yeah, because I guess the way that I asked it assumes white as the normative, right? As the default, right? The not thing.
But that's also the way that it has been perpetrated throughout history. So, like thinking about what is the default and then all this color that's laid out on top of that, right, as being separate from that. And so, yeah. I mean, one thing you said too about claiming blackness, I find that that's something that, for me, I've kind of gone in and out of, because it's okay, well, obviously I'm very light-skinned, and I can present more black or less black, but it's also a solidarity thing, and how do I acknowledge that part of me and identify as like a person of color, and what does that mean by just not being white, right? And so just not being white means something. Being black means something. Being mixed means something. All of those things, right? All wrapped up can mean something. But yeah, just thinking about how to move in and out of claiming multiple identities, and black being one of them, in addition to being also white, but claiming that blackness as a way of kind of solidarity that is still acknowledging the privilege that I have being a light-skinned and mixed person as well. But
yeah, there's so many levels of that to interact with, right? Colorism, racism, different levels of privilege within and without those, lots of constructs that I find interesting. I think episode 3 of the series talks some about this and some other things as well. And what I really like, I think it's one of the more intimate portraits of the participants, and you really get into the nitty-gritty, like love life, which I am always really, I keep touching this, really interested in. And I love, Giovanna, actually, your portrait in that session. I think you add another texture that's really needed in it. So for everyone, but I'd love, Giovanna, if you're comfortable to start. I think that episode talks about claiming blackness and a lot of different interpretations of what blackness is, and then inserts it into dating. I'd love if you could comment on, now 3 years later, I think it's been 3 years, what it's like looking at yourself and what you were thinking about dating then.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Listening to myself. I mean, I think, and I was talking with Lindsay about this before, like I don't feel disconnected from that self, but I think I'm I'm stronger, I think, in like what I know to be true. And what I have known to be true is that I experience more comfort in dating people of color. That's been true thus far, and that doesn't mean I'm closed off. And so what is that about? And like, let's delve into that. And one of the women in the film, she talked about, like, in conversation, just the comfortability of it not feeling like this science experiment or like something trying to find out about my black experience or mixed race experience, you know, and whether some of that is like my internal stuff where I'm just like, just by nature of this person being white, sitting across the table, asking me about this, and that doesn't feel right to me, which has been true some of the time. And sometimes it's just true. It's just true of my experience. And there's just something in being able to identify with this experience in this country of being a person of color that I find that has been more comfortable for me. You know, and then I think when thinking about children, there's so many layers there. Especially, I mean, I mentioned the donor choosing process. You know, because the whole idea of like having to choose a donor at all, but B, having to like actively make a selection, and it is going to be like racialized. That process is going to be, and you can't run away from it if you want to carry a child and you're not straight. So I think that's just complex, you know, and it's just a process that you know you're just going to have to address, you know, and it will be a person of color, and that's that. Yeah.
Any other dating stories, crazy or otherwise?
Well, I was dating after having been married for a long time, and it was right when you could start to go online, and you know, it was the early wild frontier days of Match.com before there was any of the millions of other fish in the ocean and the Tinder and the eHarmony and all that. Anyway, so maybe the pool just wasn't that big, but just like the choices you're talking about in finding a donor, and just like the choices people face in adopting, where you have to make explicit these things that you can and cannot live with and feel connected to in a way that, you know, people doing it biologically have easy, sort of. you have to fill out all these questionnaires that talk about who you'll date and who you won't date. And I'm, I'm this child of the 60s, and I'm just like checking everything, And what was really interesting was to see what the men who seemed like they'd be compatible with me would and wouldn't check. And more than once, I would find white men who seemed like they had a thirst for diversity and they just were interested in the world, but they would check every race except black. And I was like, okay, I can't date them. And then there would be black men who only wanted to date biracial women. I was like, well, they'll be disappointed. Because if that's what they're checking, they're making it's a skin first thing. It's the reality, this is the difference. I have my lived experience, and then I know the reality of how I look in the world. I know how I look to black and white people, how I don't get the nod on the street from my people, right? And how I do,
That's real.
People have not been able to find me in bars. Like, my friends will call and say, she's really light-skinned. No, she's really light-skinned. And they'll be like, nope, not here. I'm the only person at the bar. So as a stealth mulatto, dating was really hard because I felt like people's expectations were so divorced from who I was, just clearly, obviously, undoubtedly. So that was rough.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you been on Tinder yet? No, I'm just kidding.
Swiping! No, I'm good.
I'm realizing colorism is coming more and more to the fold, and I'm curious if we can talk about feeling black enough. I think Ko actually mentions this in the 3rd episode, saying, which really resonated with me personally, am I even black enough to date a black woman? I've had, especially in Brooklyn and New York, and I've often had the experience of I'm not really a real black girl. I'm not welcomed or allowed in this space. And noticing, I think all of us here fall on a spectrum, sort of, right, of mixedness. Does anyone have a thought about that? Giovanna, I didn't mean to cut you off. I know you were chatting about this, so if you have any thoughts and you want to start us off.
Yeah, I mean, I have a darker complexion for, the mixed people that I've encountered in my life, and that's always been true. And so people have more... Usually people assume that I'm Eritrean or Ethiopian over anything else. And so that's how I've been read, I'd say most of my life, which is not even my identity at all. Which, I mean, is very, very interesting. But I've always been and my father was very, very, very dark-skinned. And so that is so different than, I have 2 cousins who are also a mixed race, black and white, and their experience is so different. They have much fairer skin than I do. Their hair is much straighter, and also how they choose to hold on to the word black as an identifier for themselves is very different than mine. And I think so much about just how I look and how that's affected my experience. So much of it, because I look this way, I've walked on the street my whole life this way, being perceived this way, and that's informed what I identify as. And for them, it's very, very different. And so I think it's really important to stay grounded in the complexity that we're talking about when being mixed race, and how both experiences are just true. Even though we both have one black parent from the South and one white Jewish parent, with very similar histories on both sides. But here we are living very different lived experiences, identifying in very different ways.
Snaps to
that.
Yeah.
I have so many ideas percolating on that point about blackness. For me, I was raised mostly by my mother, and I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and so there I knew I was black. I identified as black. It just was my experience, also how I was sort of read. When I moved to New York 12 years ago for graduate school, that's when I encountered are you Dominican? Are you Puerto Rican? Are you Cuban? Are you Panamanian? The list went on. And so I did acknowledge and at times would claim an Afro-Latina identity. So I can feel solidarity and understand the diaspora of the Latino community and what that looks like, and even studied it. So to an extent, that has been sort of like a really interesting shift for me, sort of having an identity as a Black woman until 22, moving here, and then experiencing myself being read as an Afro-Latina in New York. I think for me, the point of place, as you mentioned earlier, is huge, right? And how we're racialized based on the context. I also have this theory and want to explore it further too, is the role of the parents, right? Like, to what extent, what does your experience look like when your mother is Black versus, like, I wonder what my experience would have been like if my mother was Black and my father was Mexican. How might my understanding of self been different? And it's something that I haven't found an answer to, but I want to continue understanding what the parent roles, and for me as someone who largely grew up with my mother, you know, I think a lot about her influence and her role in my life. I grew up with two sisters and we're really close, and so they became my supports, and we used actually the term Blaxican. Came out of a song in the 90s by a hip-hop group called Tres Delincuentes, and it was really one of the members claiming his identity. And for us, it was an opportunity for us to say, hey, there's someone that, and we have cousins in Texas and in California, but we hadn't really come across really other people who identified as Black and Mexican, and like holding those two identities together. And for us, we grew up speaking Spanish and really culturally connected to the Mexican and Chicano identity. And so to be able to hold that together at the same time was so special when we heard that term come out in that song. And so that was like our anthem in high school.
I love all of that, and that I am also curious about if anyone has answers. What is the right way for parents to talk up to their children about being mixed and about identity? I think, Lindsay, you have an interesting family life. In the video, you talk about one being in the Southwest, right? Or maybe that was in the video and you told me, and I'm telling everyone now. But also your mixed family. The part about the baby dolls and your stepmother coming home with the baby dolls, and that was obviously a choice on her part. I'm curious, what do you have to respond to Judy's potential theory?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think for me, it's part of it was like, okay, I grew up in California, in Southern California, and in this mixed household where race wasn't really talked about very much, and claiming identity was not something that was really, there wasn't space to know as a child how to navigate that. And so I feel like that's when, I mean, obviously as children we're like looking for anything, right, to kind of grasp onto, and looking so fiercely at everything. And so something as simple as that, you know, it's like, okay, well, if I look more white, does that mean I have to go around saying that I'm white? What does that mean? And so I feel like that was something for me that kind of coming into Blackness and was something that was much later, until I moved more to New York, and in college, finding a lot of other mixed race folk and trying to like be able to have these different communities so that I could feel comfortable, you know, and the difference of acknowledging, and almost, I think, to a lot of extent, feeling very insecure of like, okay, everyone sees me as white, but do they? But I know that they don't, but, you know, and kind of, I feel like that was a lot of it. Whereas now, just like, hey, you know, like,
out here.
No, but I mean, I think there's like such power in like being strong in your own identity. And I work with young people, right, with a lot of teenagers now in New York, and I am so inspired by so many of them because they can claim their identity so strongly. And that is like really awesome. Like, that's so cool. And that might change, right? That doesn't mean you have to stick to that. That means like you're trying something on as a young person and being like, yeah, this fits and I feel this, and then, you know, can try on something else house and at some point, kind of land very strongly in the middle or wherever that is.
Yeah, exciting that, young people have lots of outlets now to be able to claim and try it out and then try something different, all of that. Well, thank you ladies all so much. I think we're going to move into the Q&A portion. So for the audience, and I'm going over there. No, I'm not going over there. Hi audience, if you have a question that you'd like to ask anybody up here, please take your fancy self over to the microphone over here. Yeah.
Come on up. Well, we want to start actually. So I'm first, but we want to start with a couple of questions. We have a lively discussion going on in the YouTube chat window and also on Facebook and Twitter. So we have a couple of questions for you. The first is a Twitter question. So given the conversation that's been trending actually on Twitter recently about actor Taye Diggs and his recent comments about calling his son biracial instead of black, can the panel speak to this question about parenting mixed children? Is there something problematic about teaching your children to be proud of being mixed as opposed to the way he or she might be perceived, which is black?
We segued to that perfectly.
Nice work.
Anyone want to take that? Yeah.
As a mother of a 9-year-old who's here in this space, hi Diego. And to speak back to Lisa's point about folks being able to self-identify in the way that they want, I think where I find the dangers and have not typically identified as a mixed person or even used the term biracial, because I also understand Latino to be an ethnicity, not exactly a race, so I sort of complicate my own understanding of myself, that in that sort of idea of the mixed identity and the biracial identity, I feel it often can be sort of a celebratory way. And I think for me, they can identify as the way they need to, but for me, I find it really important to share family history and to talk about where we come from and to use simple terms and terms that our children can understand. And they are far more ready for these conversations about race than we think. My son and I started conversations on the buses here in New York City about race as early as 4, when he was 4, as I can remember. And I was always really honest with him, and I continue to be very honest with him about the questions that he has about race. We talk about our family and our identity, and it's just, and he's I guess, one could call him multiracial kid. His father is Dominican, and he's also black, and he's Mexican, so he holds these multiple identities. And so explaining to him that and being sure that he is coming to understand himself and all of that kind of complexity and beautifulness, right? So I don't know that there's an easy answer to that question. I'm going in circles here. But at the end of the day, I would hope that Taye Diggs would allow space to acknowledge and celebrate the blackness in his child and in the family, and his white side, and to be open for that dialogue, and at some point to be able to share the complications and the tensions and the terms that we throw around here in this society.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of thoughts. One is that, I haven't read about this, but I'm often suspicious of how reduced the branding is of this kind of an incident. Like, I would really want to know the sort of full spectrum of what Taye Diggs is saying to his child before I would sit in judgment of it. But there are a couple things one thing that's really important about parents, I think, of mixed race kids is that I think it's helpful for them to recognize that their task is different from their children's in terms of how they form an identity to go through the world. And one of the things that sometimes does a disservice in terms of mixed people's experiences of having been raised by parents who said, we are a beautiful rainbow family and we're all one and we're all happy together and kumbaya. And the kids having a really hard time fitting in at school because they're being asked to where are they going to sit in the cafeteria, right? So I think the sort of colorblind idealism of parents, while it's great, is sometimes not the best in service to their children, who need to be respected for the different way in which they're going to navigate identity. They cannot go back, take shelter in a homogeneous group in the way the parents can. And so that just gives them a different perspective. The other thing is, and I haven't raised a child from birth, but it sounds like when you talked about your son and when you were talking about your mother and the term mulatto, that the parents responded to the situation. And that was the teachable moment. And so it was sort of waiting for the child to be ready for it before they explain what the circumstances are and then let the child decide what to do with that information. That would be my approach.
Yeah. Do we have another Twitter question?
We do, but also feel free, if anybody thinks of a question, to come and line up behind me at the microphone. Okay, our second question from social media is from the YouTube chat. This is specifically for Lindsay. As someone interested in publishing research on mixed people and who is inspired by your work, this person is asking, how did you find avenues to create and present Evoking the Mulatto?
Well, that's a great question. I think that a lot of it, I've been fortunate enough to be able to be in different spaces that have nurtured this project. And the first one kind of starting in grad school. I did a program in arts politics at NYU, and that was really, like, for me, like, how to talk about the things that I'm most interested in and, like, how to synthesize a lot of this history that I had kind of studied and explored and in, like, you know, talking about critical race theory and all of that, while also being an artist and what does that mean. And so I was fortunate to have that avenue to really nurture the ideas, and then also be able to have now this, this fellowship with NBPC has been really amazing in order to, like, form what we have now in terms of this web series. And I think that, like, you know, up here, we're all people who are, you know, engaging in this conversation constantly in our work and in our practice and all of that. And so, like, finding those other people to do that has been so important, right? Because it's hard work to do it on your own. And so finding those spaces has been, really great.
It was a wonderful presentation. Congratulations. Truly.
Thanks, Ken.
And the topic's been broached a little bit, but going back to the upcoming census and kind of redefining, if you will, and broadening certain classifications, I feel like there's been a lot of attention, particularly on social media, about what it means to, for example, have the Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish category widened so broadly. And to your point, I think in the piece, you know, blackness being somewhat still black. And kind of, I think, as you may have articulated, you know, what that means in terms of the openness of it. Are we somehow, in our attempt to kind of push for specificity, is something being lost, or is something being, I guess, trying to navigate that conversation about what it means to try and classify everything and what you cannot? I don't know.
I think that ties into some of the earlier questions of how do we keep it complex, like how do we move around and keep it fluid and keep it sometimes problematic maybe. Lisa, do you have any thoughts?
The Census Bureau hasn't figured it out. They're asking the same questions you are, and so if you look over the history of the census, categories of race have changed many times. When there was octoroon on the race, when mulatto left the building, and really in these efforts to allow people to claim all the identities they find relevant, really they just can't figure out what to do with the Hispanic category, because the way that people respond is not the way the questions are meant to be asked. What Judy was saying before about seeing this as an ethnicity rather than a race, it's just kind of impossible. One thing that I know they were doing in 2000, and I believe also in 2010, was so one concern that people have had about what would be lost is the sort of reinforcement of affirmative action and anti-discrimination legislation in housing and education and other forums. And would that be messed up by these new ways of counting? And so even though they actually tabulate what people answer for enforcement of civil rights legislation, people are reaggregated back into minority categories. So it's a really imperfect solution, but I think it's trying to get at that complexity of this is people's lived experience, but this is also how race and racism operate in our society, and we need to be vigilant about that. So they haven't figured it out. That's the answer.
We're good. Thank you. We're going to go to another question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this. This is great. The discussion is on point. The film, thank you. My name is Sharon Gordon, and I'm actually from Jamaica, and there is big race problems in Jamaica, but nobody will say it. Because what they say is, our motto says, out of many, one people, which was really the BS that they used to make the black people to make the white minorities at the time feel like they're part of it because we were a black majority, right? So you grow up in a space where you have a family. I'm looking at you, and this is my family. My grandfather on my mother's side is Scottish. My grandmother is maroon. So then the children come out looking like Lisa, like Linda, like Giovanni. They're all mixed, right? I mean, but they're mixed in different ways. Like, how do you self-identify? And then you have the children and then on my father's side, his father is from India, Punjabi, with a very pale Jamaican woman. So you can just imagine this family of us. And all the time growing up, we could not figure out what we were. We came to America as children. And the same thing you spoke about, Lisa, it happens to us where we would all go out. We're all together. Who is that? Oh, that's my sister. Can't be. And it turns out into this whole thing. And I was like, what do we do to get this conversation beyond it just being, what I look like or whatever? And I think that what you're doing with this is really helping us open up that space because people don't want to go there. It's like it's very uncomfortable to go in this space, but we have to because we're all not looking like like Nia, or we're not looking like this. We look different, but what do we do to have this conversation and be honest about it? I think is part of it. A lot of people, they kind of jump over it and try to because they're uncomfortable and their discomfort shows. But I think with your film, with this, and this conversation, we're moving into that place now to open it up and really get into talking about this. And the census can't fix it, but hopefully in everybody talking. So it's really not a question. It's really just, I wanted to say that. I wanted to say that. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you for that comment. And I think part of it's like, one way to do this is that like we constantly talk about it, and we have more and more portraits out there, and more projects, and more people in all these different facets, right? This is one form in film and using online and new media, and thinking about what kind of audience can that reach, who's listening to that voice, and then having all these other forms, right, within academia, within all these different spaces, how can we all be talking about it and all be talking on it with all of these nuances and all these complexities to be able to push the conversation forward so that we're not, having it, and stuck in the way you're talking about. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Next question.
Hi, good evening. I guess for me, I'm mixed race, and I grew up in Africa, and then I came here, and I was born in London, so it's I've moved around a lot. But basically, what my question is to you guys is, I know for me, I found myself really isolated. I moved here, and I was living with my white father, and I always found myself constantly trying to fit in, and maybe if I was just white, I would understand him, and I was just wondering if you guys maybe went through something similar where you felt like your life might have been simpler if you were just one race, and how did you overcome that?
Oh, that's deep, girl. I don't know.
Those are great questions.
I'll just add quickly and let the other panelists chime in. I don't know. Overcome is a strong word. I think how I identify is always in flux, and I'm now more able to be comfortable with that fluctuation. But I would be lying if I took away the fact that as a child, often I wished if I were just a real black girl or just a real white girl, like I would figure it out. I would know where to sit at the lunch table. And I think it's tied to geography in that in different places I feel differently. In different spaces I feel differently and have different tensions that way. So I'll let others chime in. If you'd like, I mean.
Well, I mean, I think just I'll say quickly, it's like also going back to this tragic mulatto conversation too. That like, yeah, the struggle's real, right? But it's real for every single one of us in terms of how we come to identity. So how, so like. You know, it's also about like finding communities, finding different folks who you can identify with. But then it's also about feeling okay and feeling confident, feeling comfortable that we don't need to have all these separate categories, and that's not, you know, kind of how we're thinking about race at that age. So. I don't know. I feel like at this point too, it's like, okay, how do we not focus in on that struggle and have as many portraits of like folks who even in the struggle can talk very strongly about their own identity? I feel like that's what can breathe a lot more life into having people be comfortable with the uncomfortableness of it.
Yeah. So all those experiences. Sorry. I'm a kindergarten teacher, so like when we have a connection, we do that. So yeah, I mean, I think definitely my childhood is marked by this like here or there, which part of the lunch table with whom, but I think like race is part of this like bigger. I mean, I'm gonna call it identity, but just like learning how to be comfortable with self, and I think it can't be disconnected from that like larger narrative and like whatever self means, you know. And I think like I attribute it so much to like social and emotional learning that I went through from like K through college and is still ongoing. And race was part of the things that had to be confronted, and a very big part, and continues to be a bigger part sometimes, and sometimes it's not that much of a part of the situation. But it's just, yeah, I think there's like so many underlying themes, and in working with children, you know, you see them in kindergarten, like watching them confront race, but then also just watching them confront like what it means to just be them and be this human in this world. And so that's not to remove race from that conversation at all, because it's such a big part, and it will be, you know, of varied importance at different phases of life. But I think it's just really like what are we doing and how we prioritize, like culturally, like just self-love and self-difference and what like being human looks like in the many, many ways it can, and why that's such a hard thing, you know, as a culture to like find comfort in, like collectively, and we know why, but it's just.
We're running slightly out of time, but we'll chat later for sure. Okay. Do we have time for one more question? Do we? Just one more quick question, please. Come on up.
Yeah, the piece is great. I'm thinking about the Taye Diggs thing, which is interesting, but it brings me back to something Zoe Kravitz said about how she's just now starting to think about her blackness. And it made me think about, well, what were Lenny and Lisa kind of teaching her at home? And I wanted to kind of, my question is, why is that with the parents? Why are they not able to engage the conversation of race, particularly here in this country, with their kids so they have a better framework, formation, understanding of that? My thought would be that would need to start first and foremost with them. So why are more parents not really diving in so they can understand that and allowing, kind of leaving that to other people to teach, which probably should start with them. I mean, that's my thought. So
It's weird and hard, right?
Yeah, I think many parents do take this on with their kids. I think we hear about the ones who don't because it's problematic for the kids often, or it's sensational. But I think a lot of parents deal very directly, and especially someone with a son. I mean, assuming he has any melanin at all, he needs to know a lot, right? About how race works in this world. But I think the white parent often doesn't feel equipped to talk about race, right? It is the center. Has been at the center of the wheel for so long. My mother thought, should she buy Jet magazine and Ebony and put them on? And my dad just laughed at her because for him the experience was so, in his blood that and his lived experience that but she was just trying to grasp at a way to have this connect with her kids. What they did do was they sort of walked the walk in the sense that they chose a mixed neighborhood for us to grow up in. And that turned out to be a perverted experience because there are so few of them that are actually sort of steadily mixed. But that was an amazing way to teach me about race, permutations of race, and opportunities for what identity can be. I will say that as a kid, I wanted to look like my best friend who was a little bit darker and had a little bit curlier hair because then I would hear comments, I would hear some comments I had never heard, but I would stop hearing some comments that I did hear.
Can I just, real quick to add on to that, there are folks that are doing that research right now. There's Howard Stevenson, for example, who's out.
For sure. I'm gonna. We'll talk about it later for sure. I'm getting all types of hand signals, but but we'll still be here. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.